The Catholic Church came into power 325 AD onward, on down to 1500s, 1400s, 1300s. You can look here on the chart and see how that they grew into power. The hierarchy, here we have it from 325 on, the church and state united under Constantine. Leo II, the Pope, officially established in 500 AD. We have Catholicism. Look, as you see down here, we have infant baptism established by law. We have indulgences, where if the soldiers would go out and kill people, rape, pillage, whatever they did, to take over lands and to make converts by force, they were given indulgences. In other words, no matter what they did, rape, pillage, kill, murder, whatever they did, was okay. They're going to get to go to heaven. And purgatory was invented basically to fill the money boxes of the Vatican. We have Satan image worship. And of course, back over here, we began to, Mariolatry. They began to worship Mary. Now right up here, in 570 AD, Muhammad is born. By around 615 AD, he had established his religion, and he established it basically in many ways upon the foundation of Catholicism. Catholicism made converts by the sword. So he made converts by the sword. Now, they always say that religion is not compulsory. But it is. That was what he said when he was in Mecca. But when he was in Medina, then everything changed. It was abrogated. So God changed his mind. Allah changed his mind according to Muhammad. Muhammad is not a peaceful religion, by the way. Islam means surrender. It means to surrender. Before Muhammad died, if they took his words into account, what is written in the Quran and in the Ibn Ishaq's book on the life of Muhammad, he declared war on all religions to bring them down. Now, the Catholic Church began to persecute the Jews also. Finally, they kind of laid off after a while. The edict of Gregory the 13th, 1572-1588, who rejoiced over the massacre of Bartholomew, forced the Jews to bear a sermon every week. They made them go to church, and they had to hear a sermon from the preacher. And on every Sabbath, police agents went out to the ghetto to drive men and women and children into the church with scourges, whips, and to lash them if they did not pay attention in the church. This custom was only abolished by Pius IX, who revoked all the oppressive laws against the Jews. For this and other interesting information, you can read about the ghetto by Augustus J. C. Hare, Walks in Rome. Now we go on down and page 367 here. We are informed that the beginnings of the church in Jerusalem and most of the churches of Paul, but we do not know who first preached the gospel in Rome. Christianity, with its missionary enthusiasm for the conversion of the world, must have been found a home in the capital of the world, and it was. At the very early day before the apostles left Palestine, the congregation at Antioch grew up from immigrant and fugitive disciples of Jerusalem before it was consolidated and fully organized by Barnabas and Paul. It is not impossible, though, by no means demonstrable, that the first tidings of the gospel were brought to Rome soon after the birth. They call it the birthday of the church on the day of Pentecost. That's not the birthday of the church. The church, the birthday of the church was at the seashores of Galilee. The church had apostles in it. The church had a treasurer. The church had a clerk. The church had the Lord's Supper before the day of Pentecost. The church even had a limited commission when they sent out the 70. The sojourners from Rome, and both Jews and proselytes, in this case Peter, the preacher of the Pentecostal sermon, and by the way, Peter didn't preach the only sermon on Pentecost. There were 120 preachers there preaching all at the same time. He is said to have an indirect agency in the founding of the church in Rome, which claims him as the rock, the church of Rome does, as the rock which the church was founded on, but we know that that didn't come till much later. That the idea that Jesus was that Peter was a rock didn't come till much later. Peter denounces himself as the rock. He said Jesus was the rock and the foundation of the church. And in Matthew 16:18, it says in Hebrew, not Hebrew, but in Greek, it says, "You're Peter, a little stone, Petros. But upon this gigantic foundation rock, Petra, I shall be building my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against her." The foundation rock there was him. Mm-hmm. He is the rock of Israel, not Peter. 20 or 25 years residence there, and long exploded fable. They say Peter lived there for that long, but he did not. Paul greets the brethren in Rome, and some of his kinsmen had been converted before 37 AD. Several names in the list of Roman brethren to whom he sends greetings are found in the Jewish cemetery in the Appian Way, among the freedmen of the Empress Livia. Christians from Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece must have come to the capital for the various reasons, either as visitors or as settlers or as missionaries. Now let's go to Claudius Caesar. The first historic trace of Christianity in Rome we have in a notice of the heathen historian Suetonius, confirmed by Luke, that Claudius, about AD 52, banished the Jews from Rome. They were banished from Rome. Now remember that Tiberius Caesar and Pontius Pilate had a lot to do with lifting Jesus up. Believe it or not. I mean, you're not going to hear this a lot, but if you read the letter of Pontius Pilate to his father-in-law, Tiberius Caesar, you will hear him defending Jesus and defending himself because he was forced to have him crucified. He washed his hands, said, "I'm innocent of this man's blood," and they said, "Let his blood be upon us and our children," and boy, it has been for 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. Now there was a great insurrection, and the beginning of that insurrection was with the Sicarii. And we know that Barabbas was one of the leaders of the Sicarii. The other two men there were with him. Judas Iscariot was part of the Sicarii, and Simon the Zealot was part of the Sicarii. Being the Zealot many times meant that you were a Sicarii. The Sicarii were assassins. Insurrection, deposition, and commotion under the instigation of Creatus, misspelled for Christus. And then we go in here into Greek, and talk about the Greek words in the translations in Acts 2 and verse 10. And there Romans and Judeans both, and proselytes from all over. I can hardly read this. I need another magnifier. This commotion, and in all probability, refers to the messianic controversies between Jews and the Christians, who were not yet clearly distinguished at that time. The preaching of Christ, the true King of Israel, would naturally produce a great commotion among the Jews. They had rejected him, and yet they wanted one. They were grabbing at straws, grabbing for any false Messiah that came along. that promised them to be freed. Jesus didn't promise them to be free from Rome. He said they were to be subject to Rome. Paul in Romans the 13th chapter said they were to be subject to the rulers. They did not want revolt. They wanted to be simply left alone so they could preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Among the Jews, it did at Antioch and Pisidia and Lystra and Thessalonica and Berea, and the ignorant brethren magistrates would as naturally infer that Christ was a political pretender and aspirant to an earthly throne, which he was not. The Jews who rejected the true Messiah looked all the more eagerly for an imaginary Messiah that would break the yoke of Rome and restore the theocracy of David in Jerusalem. That wasn't going to happen, and it won't happen until we come way over here to the millennium. And then, for 1,000 years, the Jerusalem will be the capital of the world and the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ and David on his throne. Their carnal millennialism affected even some Christians. And now we've got people here that don't believe in the millennium, because this book was written in the 1800s, and a lot of Christians at that time, or a lot of people in Christendom, especially Lutherans and Presbyterians, the covenant theologians, they do not believe in the millennium. They do not believe in the rapture. They say that's carnally looking at it. Among those expelled by the edict of Claudius were Aquila and Priscilla, the hospitable friends of Paul, who were probably converted before they met him in Corinth. It goes on, the footnotes here are more than what the text is, and it tells about this and about Aquila and Priscilla. The Jews, however, soon returned, and the Jewish Christians also, but under a cloud of suspicion. They were always suspected. The Christians lived in peaceful. They didn't want any, all they wanted to be was allowed to be preached and to serve God. That's all they wanted. To this fact, Tacitus may refer when he says that the Corinthian, or that the Christian superstition, which had been suppressed for a time by the edict of Claudius, broke out again under Nero, who ascended to the throne in AD 54. Now remember, one of Nero's wives had become a Jewish convert. Then we have Paul's epistles. In the early part of Nero's reign, 54 to 68, the Roman congregation was already known throughout Christendom, had several meeting places, and considered a number of teachers, a considerable number of teachers and preachers. It was in this view, and by the way, the teachers and preachers at that time were inspired to preach and teach. They were inspired. That was one of the gifts in the church. When the Bible was completed, those gifts ceased, but at that time they had apostles that preached to them. The apostles, most of the apostles wrote the Bible, the New Testament, they wrote the New Testament, but as they got up and preached and evangelized, they were inspired to do that by the Spirit of God. It was view of this fact that the prophetic anticipation of its future importance that Paul addressed to it from Corinth, his most important doctrinal epistle in AD 58. Romans is a tremendous doctrinal epistle, and Corinthians also, and Galatians and Ephesians. The book of Hebrews is a great doctrinal epistle, which was to prepare the way for his long-desired personal visit to Rome. On his journey to Rome, 3 years later, he found Christians at Puteoli, the modern Pozzuolo, at the Bay of Naples, who desired him to tarry with them 7 days. Some 30 or 40 miles from the city, at Appi Forum and Tres Tabernae. Tres Tabernae means 3 taverns, by the way. Tres Tabernae. the Three Taverns. He was then met by Roman brethren anxious to see the writer of that marvelous letter, and derived much comfort from this token of affectionate regard. His arrival in Rome in early year AD 61, which 2 years later was probably followed by that of Peter, naturally gave great impulse to the growth of that confirmation, of that congregation, that church. Now there were several churches in Rome too. He brought with him, as he had promised, the fullness of the blessing of Christ. He brought with him inspiration. He was inspired to preach. His very bonds were overruled by the progress of the gospel, which he was left free to preach under military guard in his own dwelling house, in his own rented home. He had with him, during the whole part of the first Roman captivity, his faithful pupils and companions, and Luke, his physician. And Luke wrote what? The Gospel of Luke, the Gospel according to Luke, and the book of Acts. Many believe that the book of Acts was Luke's defense of Paul before Rome. Luke, the beloved physician and historian, Timothy, the dearest of his spiritual son, John Mark, who had deserted him in the first missionary tour, but joined him at Rome, and mediated between him and Peter, one Jesus, who is called Justus, a Jewish Christian, who remained faithful to him, Aristarchus, his fellow prisoner from Thessalonica, Tychius from Ephesians, Epaphras and Onesimus from Colossae, Epaphroditus from Philippi, Demas, Pudens, and Linus, and Eubulus. Now, Demas, that's Jim. Pudens and Claudia later on, they were the ones that went all the way into Wales. And Linus was one of the first rulers of Wales, Christian rulers. Eubulus and others who are honorably mentioned in the epistles of the captivity. Paul, a lot of people don't say this, but Paul was incarcerated 2 times in Rome. And then he was freed. And then later on Nero freed him, and then Nero had him arrested again, and that's when he was beheaded. He was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. They could not crucify him. They could not beat him or anything like that at all because he was a Roman citizen. His citizenship kept him from a lot of trials that others had to face. They found a noble band of evangelists and aided the aged apostle in his labors in Rome and abroad. On the other hand, his enemies of the Judaizers' party stimulated counter-activity and preached Christ from envy and jealousy, as Paul said in his letters. But in noble self-denial, Paul rose above their petty sectarianism and sincerely rejoiced from his lofty standpoint if only Christ was proclaimed and his kingdom promoted. The church is the administrators of the kingdom of God today, the true New Testament churches. While he fearlessly vindicated Christian freedom against Christian legalism, you know what that is? That is the Judaizers in the church. In the epistle to Galatians, he preferred even a poor, contracted Christianity to the heathenism which abounded in Rome. And remember, we studied about what Rome was like. And we read the first chapter of the book of Romans, and it talked about the wickedness there, the heathenism. The number which were converted through these various agencies, though disappearing in the heathen masses of the metropolis, no doubt much smaller than the 20,000 Jews, must have been considerable, for Tacitus speaks of a vast multitude of Christians that perished in the Neronian persecution in AD 64. Clement, referring to the same persecution, likewise mentions a vast multitude of the elect, who were contemporary with Paul and Peter, who through many indignities and tortures became most noble example among ourselves as the Roman Christians, died in terrible things. Terrible things were done to them. The composition of the church at Rome has been a matter of much learned controversy and speculation in church history. It was no doubt without, like most congregations outside of Palestine, of mixed characters with preponderance of the Gentiles over the Jewish element. But it was impossible to estimate the numerical strength and the precise relation which the two elements sustained to each other. We have no reason to suppose that it was once fully organized and consolidated into one community. There were several churches in Rome. Several churches. The Christians were scattered all over the immense city, held their devotional meetings in different localities in different churches. The Jewish and the Gentile converts may have formed distinct communities and rather than two sections of the Christian community. Paul and Peter, if they met together in Rome after AD 63, would naturally, in accordance with the Jerusalem Compact, divide the field of supervision between them as far as practical. At the same time, promote union and harmony. Peter was a Jew. Peter was never the high quality of Jew that Paul was. Paul was a Pharisee, but a Pharisee of Pharisees, the elite group, because in his home he spoke real Hebrew. The other one spoke Aramaic, a form of Hebrew, but not biblical Hebrew. Two times in the Bible, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Tongue time. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. One is in Aramaic and the other is in Hebrew. Matthew quotes it in Hebrew. This may be the truth which underlies the early and general tradition that they were joint founders of the Roman Church. They were not joint founders of the Roman Church. The church was already founded from missionaries that were sent out. No Gentile sections, but the final consolidation in one organic corporation was probably not effected till after the destruction of Jerusalem. And yet, the writer here doesn't realize what a real New Testament church is. A real New Testament church is a church that has been founded by people that had baptism from another source, from another church, that went there and they preached and they congregated together and they were established and they had baptism, they baptized the church, and then they practiced the Lord's Supper. Now, I know a lot of you don't understand this out there, but missions normally do not practice the Lord's Supper, because missions are a part of a church. And as part of a church, they go back to their mother church and take the Lord's Supper with that church, because they are not a church yet. But now let me tell you a little bit about that too. The New Testament doesn't found missions, it founds churches. Many missions are founded because they want outside support from other church sources. And so they have missions so they can have support. If they're a church, they're expected to stand on their own feet and support themselves. The consolidation was chiefly the work of Clement, who appears to be the first presiding presbyter of the one Roman church. He was admirably qualified to act as mediator between the disciples of Peter and Paul, being himself influenced by both, though more by Paul. His epistle to the Corinthians combines the distinction features of the epistle of Paul and Peter, and we're talking about Clement. Clement was one of the early pastors there. His features, the epistles of Paul and Peter and James, has been called a typical document reflecting this is not inspired, by the way, comprehensive principles of the large sympathies which had been impressed upon the united church in Rome. You might say the united churches of Rome. In the 2nd century, we see no more traces of twofold community. There were other churches there. later on in Catholicism, which this Protestant writer thinks like a Catholic and a Protestant. In the Protestant world now, Protestants come out of the Catholic Church. Protestants start from here, from Luther and Calvin. And we have Congregationalists in 1602, the Church of England in 1531. We have the Methodists in 1785, which came out of the Church of England. We have the Lutherans, basically here. This time we have Calvin over here in 1541, Presbyterian Church of Westphalia, Augsburg Confession of Faith. We have 1810, we have the Cumberland, and 1812, the Disciples. Churches are individual groups of people that don't answer to anybody else. But here, the way they look at the church, they came out of Catholicism. Now all these Protestant churches think that there is a head of a church, that they have bishops and they have pastors or priests and they have bishops. And the bishops, you answer to a bishop, and they're over territories of the church. Real New Testament churches like Baptist churches should be. Now, maybe you're part of a Baptist church that isn't like this, okay? But this is the way Baptists believe. They believe in congregational rule. That a church is a pure democracy. It doesn't answer to any other church at all. The church supports its pastor. The church calls its pastor. The church elects its officer and ordains its deacons. And it practices the Lord's Supper and it practices baptism. But outside the Orthodox Church, the heretical schools, both Jewish and Gentile, found likewise an early home in this rendezvous of the world. The fable of Simon Magus in Rome reflects this fact. Valentius, Marcion, Practus, Theodotus, Sabellius, and other arch-enemies, arch-heretics taught there also. In heathen Rome, the Christian heresies and sects enjoyed a toleration, which was afterwards denied them by Christian Rome, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church wanted to take power over everybody. True New Testament churches rule themselves. They support themselves. They call their preachers. The Bible is their rule of faith and practice. Denied them by Christian Rome until 1870, it became the capital of United Italy against the protests of the Pope. And then he set aside the Vatican as a total different entity. The language of the Roman Church at that time was what? Hellenes, Greek, Koine Greek, and continued to be down to the 3rd century. From 331 BC, with Alexander the Great, to 331 AD, the Koine Greek was a language of the world at that time. But the Catholic Church in 331, after that period of time, began to take the Bible away from the people. Constantine originally had 50 copies of the Bible made in Greek, Old and New Testament. There are 3 of them in extant today: Codex Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Sinaiticus. They were all printed out, but then the Catholic Church changed the language of the religious language to Latin. And that went on to my lifetime. The Catholic Church did all their masses, all their high masses basically were in Latin. The people didn't understand what the priest was saying. Didn't understand at all. But they knew when to bow, they knew when to bow their head, they knew when to cross themselves by rote. The Catholic Church took the Bible from the people and demanded that no one read the Bible. Because if you read the Bible, you wouldn't be a Catholic. You'd find out that the Baptists were right. Later on, that some of the Protestants were right. The Protestants were more right than the Catholics, of course. The Baptists were correct. Always. Even though there have been some heretical Baptist groups. Everything was written in Greek. All the way during this time, the Bible was preached in Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. By the way, I have up there's a whole, all 27 books of the New Testament, I have handwritten from Greek, translated them and written a commentary and all the grammar in there also. The Greek language is very important when you study the New Testament because it was written in Greek. All early literature of the Roman Church was Greek. Even the so-called Apostles' Creed, in the form held by the Church of Rome, was originally in Greek. The first Latin version of the Bible was not made for Rome, but for the provinces, especially for North Africa. The Greeks and Greek-speaking Orientals were, at that time, the most intelligent, enterprising. You know, the Greek language is the most precise language ever been produced. Now, the reason why we have the legal languages today, the legal language, the attorneys that out there, all of the legal language is written in Latin because the Church of Rome ruled the world, and it ruled it in Latin. And it rubbed off on us even to this day. All the legal terms are in Latin. The Greeks and Greek-speaking Orientals were at that time most intelligent, enterprising, and energetic people among the middle classes of Rome. The successful tradesmen, the skilled artisans, the confidential servants, the retainers of noble houses, almost all of the activity and enterprise of the common people, whether good or for evil, was written in Greek. All contracts were written in Greek. Greek has 8 cases in it. You know, nominative, genitive, locative, instrumental, dative, accusative, vocative. English has nominative and objective. That's all. Modern Greek does not have the language, the beautiful and precise language of the Koine Greek, or the classical. The social condition of Rome at that time, the great majority of the Christians in Rome, even down to the close of the 2nd century, belonged to the lower ranks of society, even though they had begun in middle class and upper class. They were artisans, freedmen, and slaves. The proud Roman aristocracy, the wealth of power, the knowledge, despised the gospel as a vulgar superstition. The contemporary writers ignored it, or mentioned it only incidentally with the evident contempt. The Christian spirit and the old Roman spirit were sharply and irreconcilably antagonistic against each other, and sooner or later had to meet in deadly conflict. Christians never persecuted anybody. True Christians. The Catholic Church persecuted. The Protestant Church persecuted. Baptists never persecuted. The Baptists stood strong in developing America. They stood strong in developing the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of America. They fought for that Constitution. They fought for freedom because they wanted some place where they could preach. America, you could not preach as a Baptist for many, many years after the colonies were here in America. They took and they whipped, they beat, they killed, they strangled, they drowned Baptists in America. But as in Athens, Corinth, so there were in Rome also a few honorable exceptions. Paul mentions his success in the Praetorian Guard in the imperial household. It is possible, though not probable, that Paul became passively acquainted with the Stoic philosopher Ananias Seneca, the teacher of Nero, the friend of Burrus. By the way, Nero had him killed. He killed his mother, he killed his wife, killed his brothers, everybody. He killed everybody. For he certainly knew his brother Annas Gallio, proconsul at Corinth, and then at Rome, and had probably official relations with Burrus as prefect of the Praetorian Guard, to which he was committed as a prisoner. But the story of the conversion of Seneca, as well as his correspondence with Paul, are somewhat doubtful and fictitious. Pontius Pilate's letter to Tiberius is valid. It's quoted by all historians. Many things in history there are a lot of bogus writings. There's some valid ones. And I've read almost all of this. And I will say what is valid and what isn't, in my opinion. And if true, would be no credit to Christianity, since Seneca, like Lord Bacon, denied his high moral principles by his service, avarice, and meanness. Christians were not mean. They did not persecute each other. Pomponia Graecina, the wife of Aulus Platus, the conqueror of Britain, who was arraigned for foreign superstition about the year 758, though pronounced innocent by her husband and led a life of continual sorrow until her death in 83, was probably the first Christian lady in the Roman nobility. The predecessor of the ancient Paula and Eustathium, the companions of Jerome, Claudia and Pudens, from whom Paul sends greetings in 2 Timothy 4:21, and their son Linus, have by an ingenious conjecture been identified with a couple of that name, who are respectively mentioned by Martial in his epigrams, but this is doubtful, it says. The generation later, two cousins of the Emperor Domitian, 81 through 96, T. Flavius Clemens, consul in 95, and his wife Flavia Domitia were accused of atheism. That's Christianity. And that is of Christianity, and condemned the husband to death, the wife to exile, 1896. Recent excavations of the catacombs of Domitilia, near that of Callistus, established the fact that an entire branch of the Flavian family had embraced the Christian faith. Such a change was wrought within 50 or 60 years after Christianity had entered Rome. I hope that you've learned from this. I hope it's not boring to you. It's not boring to me. We're talking about real people in real time, what they believe. And these are your forefathers in the faith. Here, your forefathers in the faith. I read history because history has got so much theology in it. And the theology that we have should be valid from the Bible today. And it should have been carried down through all history. And as you see the trail of blood here, they believe those things which we believe today. All the way from the seashores of Galilee to here in Fish Lake Valley. Bakersfield, California, Los Angeles, Missouri with Steve and Kathy, all the way back there. All the way to different places, go all the way to Wales, all the way to Pennsylvania, Nancy. All these people all over the world, we look at the Bible and we read the Bible correctly. And that is our rule of faith and practice. Our Father, we send this word out to you today, this lesson for your honor and glory, to build up your people, to let them know what they believe and why they believe it, and that it's not novel today, but it's gone down through all ages.